Remember, again, that these people want to put medical records, driver's licenses, professional accreditations, and real estate deeds into their system. They should not be trusted.
Look, we're not going to go into each and every one of these use cases individually because, frankly, I'm already getting tired of typing up this seemingly endless script. We're closing in on page 30, we're not nearly done yet, and I'm starting to get carpal tunnel at this point. We'll instead focus on one use case that was mentioned earlier, but only briefly touched upon to assure us of its absurdity: medical records. And this one is of particular interest to me as both a doctor and a patient. How could anyone look at a public blockchain and think that private medical records belonged on it? Shouldn't they remain, well, private? Is Dan Olson somehow the only person smart enough to have noticed this? Well, it turns out there's an entire body of peer-reviewed literature on the subject, published not only in computer security journals, but also in medical systems journals by people with PhDs who definitely didn't forget about the standard of privacy expected from personal medical records. This is not an afterthought to them. Blockchain-based data preservation systems, or DPS, are the subject of intensive R&D that can provide privacy via... But hold on, before we skip straight to answers here, let's motivate the discussion. Why would we even consider blockchains in medical record systems? What problems can be solved? So, hospitals store patient medical records in their databases, and when a doctor needs a prescription record, the service system extracts the required data from the database. However, as data stored in these databases can be stolen or tampered with or even deleted completely, the accuracy of these records can't actually be verified. If the data are submitted to third-party notarization companies for verification and preservation, personal information may be leaked, and ultimately it's difficult to guarantee the reliability and availability of preservation because the third party's credibility can't actually be confirmed except from external standards set by yet another third party. This is where the immutability property of blockchains comes into play. There's also the growing threat of ransomware attacks on hospitals. The basic form of an attack like this is that attackers gain access to a hospital's EMR and then encrypt the data therein. Then they require a ransom in return for the decryption key. Now, this has been happening more recently, and ultimately it's also becoming more and more easy to actually carry out an attack like this. There are actually black market sites where you can buy the software and technology that you need to do something like this in a turnkey fashion. There are literally groups that make this software and make it easy to use so that you can just hold a hospital hostage, basically. And ultimately, the benefits of blockchain technology for this particular use case is pretty self-explanatory. You can't hold the entire Ethereum smart contract platform hostage from any single entity. In order to set up a blockchain solution, we have to ensure a few basic things. So for one, no one except the authorized institution has to have access to the patient's private medical data. For non-clinical purposes, for instance for research purposes, it may be important that a patient needs to prove that their data meets the standards that that institution is looking for in their studies. Even more important for both clinical and non-clinical purposes, any entity that a patient releases their information to needs to make sure that that data can be recorded and acknowledged, but only in a way that protects that patient's privacy. So then we come back to how can we solve these problems with blockchain technology? Well, there's many potential solutions, and we're going to go over a number of them. But just remember that at this point, we're at a very early phase in, research in general into this field. People are still proposing and prototyping ideas to see which might work the best for this particular use case. An early paper by Lee et al. 2018 in the Journal of Medical Systems presented an Ethereum-based DPS that used things called proofs of primitiveness, which at its later iterations can potentially include things like symmetric key cryptography that can be used to assure the privacy of personal data. They proposed data storage schemes and multimodal cryptographic approaches to enhance security, which allow records to be preserved permanently and which allow for verification to check for tampering. Now, we see that many previous approaches actually avoided storing data, the actual medical records, on-chain, for exactly the reasons that Folding Ideas has pointed out. And indeed, we even see more recent approaches like Lavagna et al. 2021 in wireless personal communications are actually hybrid approaches of cloud and blockchain integration. Lee et al.'s paper was one of the early complex schemes published in a peer-reviewed journal that found some ways around the inconvenient publicity of blockchains for this use. Under the proposed setups, even if one were to gain inappropriate access to those medical records, they would not be readily human readable without a particular key. Now, the paper I'm referring to does emphasize that ultimately these are still prototype schemes and they're not necessarily being sold as ready for prime time just yet. But it's an interesting possibility. A variety of approaches have been proposed to maximize privacy on blockchain medical record systems. In 2018, Chen et al. Described a system where patients receive their medical records from an institution after having seen their doctor, and they're given a private key. They then have to verify the institution's signature, and then they send it back, which generates another encryption key that is stored on the cloud. The usage rights of the medical data are completely in control of the user, and patients may authorize any third-party agency to access some of their medical data through access control mechanisms, and that allow them to withdraw their consent and authorization at any time. To limit the usefulness of on-chain analysis and unmasking patient identities, a few systems have been proposed. Chowdhury proposed a zero-knowledge provable mixing scheme, and Park et al. Suggested the use of ZK snarks, which we've already talked about earlier in the video. Others have suggested the use of biometric backups in case private keys are lost, while Medical Chain, a specialty chain that has already been deployed in research contexts, uses a bracelet that can be scanned in the case of this eventuality. Now, we should note that even as recently as April 2021, a review by Fang et al. In the Journal of Medical Internet Research showed that the most common models being researched right now include permissioned blockchains and off-chain storage. So when all is said and done, a permissionless on-chain solution may not end up being optimal for this particular use. Some models simply tether the blockchain to existing EMR applications. Public distributed decentralized object storage networks like NeoFS, which could end up being critical infrastructure for blockchain implementations in multiple industries, are also being researched as a potential solution in some models. The takeaway here overall is that only a few blockchain medical record system solutions have actually been deployed so far, and the whole field is in such an early stage right now that it's hard to say what the final form of this idea will end up being.